for more insight into Brazil and China's ties, as well as CELAC and China as a whole, let's bring in Gustavo Ribeiro. He is the founder and editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report. Good to see you again, Gustavo. Thanks for taking time to chat.
Thanks for having me again.
Okay, what do we know so far about the $9 billion credit line that President Xi has announced? And who do you think is going to benefit first? And what kind of projects in Brazil do you think are going to be prioritized?
So one thing that is interesting is that we talk about $9 billion, but it is actually a 66 billion yuan credit line, and it is part of efforts to internationalize the yuan. The credit line will serve to deepen further strategic and economic ties between Latin America and China. And I mean, in Brazil, for instance, Planning Minister Simone Tebet says that China wants to crisscross the country with railroads linking agricultural producing hubs to ports to facilitate taking commodity exports to ports, for instance, in Peru, or to ports in the north of Brazil in order to facilitate trade between the two nations, especially now that Brazilian agricultural producers are, like Paulo said, expecting more trade with China.
Yeah, exactly. I want to talk about that. Let's talk about some of the other conversations that we can expect later on this week, and especially the visa-free travel proposal, because that has certainly benefited China, but how is it going to benefit Latin America and Brazil as a whole?
Well, the list of countries with no visa travel has not been made public, but for instance, in the case of Brazil, that is something that is going to facilitate more travel between business leaders and business associations, because there's a lot of interest to do business with China, especially now that relations with the U.S. have become more uncertain. I have talked to a few leaders, a few associations in the tech sector, and they see that there is more openness to do business with China, even though some of them, they're not as keen to make public their willingness to do business with China because they fear retaliation from the Trump administration.
Interesting. Let's talk about the U.S. too, because Latin America has been obviously in the backyard of the United States, and for years and years and years, strong ties. But China really, since 2009, has been the largest trading partner with Brazil. So how is China positioning itself differently in Latin America right now, as well as the Caribbean, compared to past investment waves?
Well, not only Brazil, but several other countries in Latin America have China as their main destination for exports. We have seen, for instance, several countries severing ties with Taiwan in order to have closer ties with Beijing. And this time, like more and more, we're seeing that the neglect that we see from European countries or the U.S. towards Latin America has opened this huge pathway for China to increase its influence, to increase its economic ties. Lula said, for instance, during the select meeting in Beijing, that the European Union, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, has turned to Eastern Europe and has neglected Latin America. So it's not that China is taking influence away from Western powers, is that China is filling a void that has been left by these powers.
Exactly. And CELAC as well. The CELAC countries have varied economic and political systems. And how are they responding to this offer? And are there concerns about sovereignty or debt? Because we've heard that crop up with the Belt and Road in the past.
Well, Latin American economies are fragile, and there's always fear. For instance, when administrations are very pro-U.S., you have the opposition saying that there's risk that when we have changes in the White House, that could cause several problems to these countries. And for instance, in the case of Colombia, Colombia has pledged to join the Belt and Road Initiative. The right-wing opposition there says that, well, we shouldn't rely on China too much. Now, Petro says that he's trying to build bridges with both countries, but his relationship with Washington has been rocky. There's also the thing is, whenever you rely too much on just one partner, you expose yourself to hiccups. For instance, in Brazil, we used to say in the 70s and 60s that if the U.S. had the sniffles, Brazil would catch pneumonia.
Yeah.
Now that's not necessarily the case because the U.S. Brazil is much less reliant on the U.S. So the more you have a varied trade portfolio, the more secure you are from external shocks, right?
Yeah, and Gustavo, at the top of the interview, you talked about the strengthening yuan. To what extent in this meeting and China's push into the region in response to the U.S. policies under the Trump administration? Because the currency swap is a clear sign. The fluctuations in the U.S. dollar creating all sorts of uncertainty in Washington, and it makes dealing with China seemingly a way to avoid chaos, especially if you have massive debt like Brazil has right now.
Well, that is the main messaging from Beijing during this meeting is that China. They present China as a more reliable partner rather than the U.S., especially because of these erratic tariff policies. The fact that the way Trump has upended global trade has really hurt Latin American currencies, especially the Brazilian real or the Peruvian sol. We are seeing, we saw several messages, some that were thinly veiled, some that were not veiled at all. For instance, one said that it's clear who is a reliable friend of Latin America. And Lula also said that Latin America should deepen its engagement with China. Let's remember that during the first 8 years of Lula in power, 2003, 2010, that South-South cooperation was the North Star of his diplomacy, and that's something that he wants back again.